εγκαίρως. Σε πολύ λίγα δευτερόλεπτα, λοιπόν, θα ξεκινήσουμε. Βεβαίως, η τέταρτη και στρογγυλή τράπεζα συντονίζεται από την διδάκτορα κυρία Εύη Βουλγαράκη, μέλος ΕΔΗ του Τμήματος Κοινωνικής Θεολογίας και Θρησκεολογίας. Και αυτό βεβαίως είναι εύλογο, διότι, όπως είπαμε, η κυρία Βουλγαράκη, και το γνωρίζουν όλοι, είναι, αν όχι η ψυχή, ένα πολύ σημαντικό μέρος της ψυχής της σημερινής πολύ όμορφης εμπειρίας μας, διεθνούς εμπειρίας μας. Η κυρία Βουλγαράκη είναι μαζί μου αυτή τη στιγμή. Νομίζω ότι σε πολύ λίγα δευτερόλεπτα είμαστε έτοιμοι να της παραδώσουμε τη σκητάλη.
Good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, dear speakers, dear friends, dear students. Thank you for being here with us. Okay, now we are fine. Can you hear me? Okay. We started with a little delay because we had a very interesting and a bit heated discussion during the previous channel. And we felt we needed a small break, so apologize. We are Greeks, Greek and African, so our understanding of time, you can tolerate us, please. So all speakers are set, and in panel 4, we are going to have a broader approach. We will discuss creative concerns of African society today. We discuss religiosities and rights, and also the overall social situation. So far, we have discussed issues that concern the Orthodox Church as well as the other churches. We had an overview of missiological problems. And now although we are not shifting completely, we want to have a broader lens. So we shall start according to schedule with Associate Professor Nikos Magioros, unless I have forgotten anything about time predicaments. So Professor Nikos Magioros, he was recently elected full professor, so we start by congratulating him.
Thank you.
And he's the president of the theology department in Thessaloniki, Aristotle University of Thessaloniki. He is professor of canon law, and he will speak on the topic Religion, Society, and Human Rights in Africa, a Contemporary Approach. The floor is yours, Professor.
Okay. Thank you very much for the warm presentation. I would like to welcome all the participants and all the colleagues. Many thanks to the organizers for the invitation, especially Professor Christinaki and Dr. Vulgaraki. But I need to apologize. I must apologize because I didn't have the time to prepare my presentation in English. So I need to shift in Greek. So I hope I will not disappoint you so much about that. Το θέμα, καλησπέρα σε όλους καταρχήν, ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ για την πρόσκληση. Το θέμα της δικής μου εισήγησης έχει να κάνει με τη σχέση κοινωνίας, θρησκείας και δικαιωμάτων στον χώρο της Αφρικής. Πραγματικά είναι ένα πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρον θέμα και θα τολμούσα να πω πως τουλάχιστον από την πλευρά την νομοκανονική, αν θέλετε, την πλευρά της μελέτης των σχέσεων θρησκείας και πολιτικής, δεν έχουμε πάρα πολλές τέτοιες προσεγγίσεις, μεγάλη βιβλιογραφία. Έτσι για να μπορέσω να ανταποκριθώ στις απαιτήσεις αυτής της εισήγησης, χρησιμοποίησα ξένη βιβλιογραφία και οφείλω να αναφέρω την καθηγήτρια κυρία Γκριν, η οποία έχει ασχοληθεί πάρα πολύ για το ζήτημα του νόμου και της θρησκείας στην Αφρική. πάνω στα έργα της οποίας στηρίχθηκα για τη σημερινή εισήγηση. Ουσιαστικά το θέμα μας αφορά το σύνηθες θέμα της σχέσης θρησκείας στη δημόσια σφαίρα. Βέβαια εδώ αυτό το θέμα το προσαρμόζουμε, το επικεντρωνόμαστε στο χώρο της Αφρικής. Δύο πράγματα. Αυτή η σχέση θρησκείας και πολιτικής δεν είναι κάτι καινούριο. Έτσι. Είναι, θα λέγαμε, μια παραδοσιακή σχέση, η οποία έχει χιλιετίες ζωής. Και βεβαίως για να υπάρχει αυτή η σχέση δηλαδή θρησκείας και πολιτικής επί της ουσίας, υπάρχει κάποιος λόγος. Και θεωρώ ότι ο λόγος αυτός έχει να κάνει και με τις δύο πλευρές, και με τη θρησκεία αλλά και με την πολιτική. Ο νόμος και η θρησκεία λοιπόν, θρησκεία και πολιτική. Με μια μεριά η θρησκεία έχει ανάγκη τον νόμο για να εξασφαλίσει την ενότητά της, την ασφάλειά της, να σταθεροποιήσει δομικά την οργάνωσή της και βεβαίως αυτό που λέμε και στο κανονικό δίκαιο, την εφταξία της. Αυτό το έχουμε ζήσει, το έχουμε δει στην Ορθόδοξη παράδοση, την Δικαιική. Από την άλλη μεριά έχουμε την πολιτεία, η οποία νομοθετεί πρωτογενώς, έτσι, και από τη θρησκεία μπορεί να λάβει την πνευματική διάσταση, την πνευματικότητα γενικότερα, και βεβαίως κάποιες ηθικές αρχές, οι οποίες είναι πάρα πολύ σημαντικές, όπως είναι η αντίληψη περί ισότητας, περί δικαιοσύνης, και βεβαίως και σε μια κοινωνική διάσταση η θρησκεία εξασφαλίζει ως ένα μεγάλο βαθμό την κοινωνική συνοχή. Αν και βέβαια συχνά μπορεί να γίνει παράγοντας κοινωνικής έντασης και διαίρεσης, είναι πολύ σημαντικό ότι παραδοσιακά η θρησκεία αποτέλεσε ένα σημαντικό παράγοντα για την κοινωνική ειρήνη και την κοινωνική συνοχή, το οποίο είναι ζητούμενο και της πολιτείας αλλά και των πολιτών, και βεβαίως αυτή η παραδοσιακή αξία ισχύει και σήμερα στο ευρωπαϊκό τουλάχιστον πλαίσιο το δικό μας, αλλά θα τολμούσα να πω και στο αφρικανικό πλαίσιο, το οποίο σιγά σιγά θα προσπαθήσω να περιγράψω. Άρα λοιπόν επιγραμματικά δίκαιο και θρησκεία, θρησκεία και πολιτισμός, θρησκεία και πολιτική. Αυτό λίγο πολύ θα είναι το πλαίσιο μέσα στο οποίο θα κινηθεί αυτή η μικρή εισήγηση. Πριν όμως ξεκινήσουμε έτσι λίγο πιο ειδικά την ανάλυση αυτών των ενιών, θα ήθελα να κάνουμε μία αναφορά στο ποια είναι η κατάσταση στην Αφρική και πώς η Αφρική σε επίπεδο θρησκειών, δηλαδή, ποιος θα είναι ο χάρτης των θρησκειών μέχρι το 2050. Δεν ξέρω αν έχει αναφερθεί από κάποιον άλλο συνάδελφο, αλλά νομίζω ότι είναι πολύ σημαντικό να έχουμε έτσι μία ιδέα, γιατί δεν πρόκειται για βεβαιότητα από τη στιγμή που στηριζόμαστε σε ένα project, σε μία προβολή δηλαδή στοιχείων, τα οποία το κέντρο, το Pew Research Center στην Αμερική έχει συγκεντρώσει και έχει επεξεργαστεί. Νομίζω θα είναι έτσι σημαντικό να καταλάβουμε ποια είναι η δυναμική της θρησκείας στην Αφρικανική Ήπειρο μέχρι το 2050. Ο συνολικός πληθυσμός αναμένεται να αυξηθεί με τον ταχύτερο ρυθμό από οποιαδήποτε άλλη περιοχή του κόσμου τις επόμενες δεκαετίες, υπερδιπλασιάζοντας ο πληθυσμός από 823 εκατομμύρια που ήταν το 2010 σε 1,9 δις μέχρι το 2050. Αντιλαμβάνεστε τα μεγέθη. Στο πλαίσιο αυτό, οι δύο βασικές θρησκείες, οι μεγαλύτερες θρησκείες στην Αφρική, ο χριστιανισμός και το Ισλάμ, αναμένεται να έχουν περισσότερους από διπλάσιους οπαδούς από το 2050 από ό,τι είχαν το 2010. Οι χριστιανοί ο χριστιανισμός θα παραμείνει η μεγαλύτερη θρησκευτική κοινότητα της περιοχής και από 517 εκατομμύρια που έχει το 2010 θα ανεβεί στο 1,1 δισεκατομμύριο το 2050. το Ισλάμ αναμένεται να αυξηθεί με ταχύτερο ρυθμό από ότι ο χριστιανισμός. Ο χριστιανισμός θα ανεβεί με ένα ποσοστό 115%, το Ισλάμ θα ανεβεί με ένα ποσοστό 170% και από 248 εκατομμύρια που είχε το 2010 θα πάει στα 670 εκατομμύρια. Οι υπόλοιπες θρησκείες που και σε αυτές πρέπει να αναφερθούμε, οι οποίες ανήκουν στην ευρύτερη κατηγορία των παραδοσιακών θρησκειών, αλλά και το ποσοστό αυτών που δηλώνουν ότι δεν ανήκουν σε κάποια θρησκεία, θα γνωρίσουν μια μέτρια ανάπτυξη, ενώ φαίνεται πως ο εβραϊκός πληθυσμός θα συρρικνωθεί. Ναι. Έτσι λοιπόν, ο πληθυσμός, οι χριστιανοί το 2010 είχαν το 62,9, ένα ποσοστό 62,9. Το 2050 θα μειωθεί αυτό το ποσοστό, παρόλο δηλαδή που θα αυξηθεί ο αριθμός τους, θα μειωθεί στο 58,5. Γιατί ακριβώς θα υπάρξει αυτή η αύξηση από την πλευρά του Ισλάμ, που το 2050 θα έχουν το 35%, άνω του 35% του πληθυσμού. Οι παραδοσιακές θρησκείες θα είναι στο 3,2%, αυτοί που δηλώνουν ότι δεν ανήκουν σε κάποια θρησκεία στο 2,7%, οι λοιπές θρησκείες στο 0,2%, οι Ινδουιστές στο 0,1%, οι Βουδιστές στο λιγότερο από 0,1% και οι Βουδιστές και οι Εβραίοι λιγότεροι από το 0,1%. Είπαμε λοιπόν ότι ο πληθυσμός αυτός θα υπερβεί, θα φτάσει κοντά στο 1,9 δισεκατομμύριο ανθρώπους. Τώρα, οι παράγοντες που θα οδηγήσουν σε αυτή την αλλαγή, τη ραγδαία αλλαγή, είναι τα ποσοστά γονιμότητας, έτσι, στις δύο ταχύτερα αναπτυσσόμενες θρησκευτικές ομάδες, το οποίο υπερβαίνει το 2,1%, 2,1 παιδιά ανά γυναίκα. Και οι δύο, για να αυξηθεί ο πληθυσμός, πρέπει να υπάρχει μεγαλύτερο από το 2,1 παιδιά ανά γυναίκα. Επίσης, άλλο στοιχείο είναι το ότι αυτές οι ομάδες που θα αυξηθούν με αυτόν τον γρήγορο ρυθμό, είναι το ότι το 2010 είχαν πολλοί νέους, μια νεολαία σε μεγάλο βαθμό. Δηλαδή, οι μισοί μουσουλμάνοι της περιοχής το 2010, το 46% δηλαδή ήταν κάτω των 15 ετών. Παρόμοια ποσοστά έχουμε και για τους χριστιανούς. Τώρα, υπάρχει και ένας άλλος παράγοντας, ο οποίος έχει να κάνει με την αλλαγή στο θρήσκευμα, έτσι, και βεβαίως η μετανάστευση. Αυτός λίγο πολύ θα είναι ο χάρτης, σύμφωνα βέβαια, πάντα επαναλαμβάνω, με το project αυτό του γνωστού αμερικάνικου κέντρου, το οποίο σε γενικές γραμμές, επαναλαμβάνω, μπορεί να μην είναι ακριβώς, αλλά νομίζω ότι είναι πολύ σημαντικό, γιατί μας δείχνει αυτή την κατεύθυνση. Πού θα πάνε δηλαδή τα πράγματα. Τώρα, θα ξεκινήσω λέγοντας έτσι κάνοντας μια γενική προσέγγιση της έννοιας της θρησκείας στο χώρο της Αφρικής. Βέβαια, εδώ για να αντιληφθούμε λίγο καλύτερα τα πράγματα, πρέπει να κάνουμε την εξής παρατήρηση, πως ο όρος, το νόημα, το περιεχόμενο της λέξης θρησκείας, το οποίο αντιλαμβανόμαστε εμείς στην Ευρώπη, είναι διαφορετικό με τον τρόπο με αυτόν που οι Αφρικανοί αντιλαμβάνονται. Εμείς, ο όρος religio στα λατινικά, έτσι, σύνδεση του φυσικού με το μεταφυσικού, έχει μια πιο καθαρή, πιο ξεκάθαρη, ένα ξεκάθαρο περιεχόμενο, δεδομένου το ότι οι σχέσεις αυτές διαμορφώθηκαν στο πλαίσιο των αυτοκρατοριών, και άρα λοιπόν το γενικότερο πλαίσιο των σχέσεων θρησκείας και πολιτικής είχε μια ιστορική συνέχεια, η οποία προσέδωσε και στην πολιτεία και στη θρησκεία ένα συγκεκριμένο περιεχόμενο. Βεβαίως με πολλές αλλαγές ή ανάλογα την εποχή. Τώρα, το ειδικότερο όσον αφορά την έννοια της θρησκείας στην Αφρική είναι ότι συνδέεται με την αποικιοκρατία. Και βεβαίως ο τρόπος με τον οποίο οι αποικιοκράτες πέρασαν την έννοια της θρησκείας στην Αφρική αντικατοπτρίζει ένα τυπικό δυτικό λεξιλόγιο και βεβαίως τον δυτικό τρόπο αντίληψης του όρου θρησκεία. Βέβαια το ίδιο πρόβλημα έχουμε και με τον όρο θρησκεία τόσο στον Ιουδαϊσμό αλλά και στο Ισλάμ. Έτσι. Ειδικότερα για το Ισλάμ, για παράδειγμα, η θρησκεία ταυτίζεται με την έννοια του νόμου. Έτσι. Στο δυτικό τρόπο, η δυτική έννοια της θρησκείας είναι διαφορετική, όπως βεβαίως και οι σχέσεις οι οποίες χαρακτηρίζουν την δυτική αντίληψη σε σχέση με το κράτος, που είναι ο διαχωρισμός ή τέλος πάντων η διακριτή ρόλη ή σε κάθε περίπτωση ένας διπολισμός. Έτσι λοιπόν, religion, θρησκεία στο αφρικανικό εθνικό δίκαιο και πιο συγκεκριμένα η σχέση μεταξύ θρησκείας και πολιτισμού φαίνεται πως είναι αναπόσπαστα συνδεδεμένο. Θρησκεία και πολιτισμός για τους Αφρικανούς είναι δύο έννοιες που είναι άρρηκτα δεμένες. Και ενδεχομένως ο πολιτισμός είναι μια ευρύτερη έννοια στην οποία σε κάθε περίπτωση η θρησκεία αποτελεί ένα βασικό στοιχείο της. Έτσι λοιπόν στο αφρικανικό πλαίσιο η θρησκεία είναι βαθιά ριζωμένη στην πολιτιστική παράδοση. Είναι χαρακτηριστικό πως σε μια πρόσφατη απόφαση του Συνταγματικού Δικαστηρίου της Νότιας Αφρικής αναφέρεται πως η θρησκεία αφορά συνήθως την προσωπική πίστη και τις πεποιθήσεις, ενώ ο πολιτισμός σχετίζεται γενικά με παραδόσεις και πεποιθήσεις που αναπτύσσονται από μια κοινότητα. Και προσθέτει η απόφαση αυτή ότι η θρησκεία και ο πολιτισμός μπορεί να επικαλύπτονται και ότι οι πολιτιστικές αντιλήψεις ή οι πρακτικές μπορεί να είναι τόσο ισχυρές και τόσο σημαντικές για εκείνους που τις έχουν, όσο και οι θρησκευτικές πεποιθήσεις για αυτούς που πιστεύουν σε κάποια ανώτερη δύναμη. Έτσι λοιπόν, ακόμα και σε ένα νομικό πλαίσιο φαίνεται ότι υπήρξε αυτή η προβληματική των σχέσεων θρησκείας και πολιτισμού. Ιδιαίτερα νομίζω είναι σημαντικό αυτό, γιατί αυτό χαρακτηρίζει, και θα δούμε και στη συνέχεια, και την σύγκρουση που πολλές φορές δημιουργείται και μεταξύ του πολιτισμού, των παραδοσιακών εθήμων και των ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων. Έτσι λοιπόν, οι παραδοσιακές αφρικανικές μορφές λατρείας, και εδώ πρέπει να πούμε δύο πράγματα για να καταλάβουμε, κάποια βασικά πράγματα για να καταλάβουμε πως στο πλαίσιο της θρησκείας και του πολιτισμού εντάσσονται κάποια συγκεκριμένα τελετουργικά, κάποιες συγκεκριμένες μορφές λατρείας, οι οποίες είναι πλούσιες όσον αφορά το τελετουργικό κομμάτι τους. Και ένας από τους λόγους ακριβώς γιατί υπάρχει μια πλούσια τελετουργία, που οι χαρισματικές λεγόμενες θρησκείες, μιλάω περισσότερο για τις διάφορες εκφράσεις του ακραίου ενδεχομένως προτεσταντισμού, είναι ιδιαίτερα δημοφιλείς στις αφρικανικές κοινότητες. Έτσι, ένα σημείο το οποίο πρέπει να τονίσουμε, να αναφερθούμε, είναι η λατρεία εντός εισαγωγικών των προγόνων. Συνήθως λέμε πως στην Αφρική λατρεύουν τους προγόνους, ενδεχομένως όμως τα πράγματα να μην είναι ακριβώς έτσι, γιατί γιατί ας πούμε λέμε τους λατρεύουμε την έννοια ότι το να καλούμε, να γίνεται μια αναφορά στους προγόνους, να υπάρχει ένα αίτημα για να αποφύγουν ένα κακό ή να προστατεύσουν την κοινότητα, δεν αποτελεί αναγκαστικά μια λατρεία στους προγόνους, αλλά μια αναφορά, μια έκκληση, μια παράκληση, έτσι, και αυτή η διάσταση είναι ιδιαίτερα σημαντική, η σύνδεση δηλαδή αυτή με τους προγόνους, γιατί δεν αφορά μόνο συγκεκριμένους ανθρώπους οι οποίοι αποτελούν παρελθόν για τους οικείους τους, αλλά γενικότερα την έννοια των προγόνων ως μια συνολική έννοια που ουσιαστικά έχει να κάνει με τη συνέχεια της φυλής, με τη συνέχεια της κοινότητας, με τη σχέση δηλαδή η οποία συνεχίζεται, η πορεία δηλαδή της κοινότητας η οποία συνεχίζεται στο χώρο και στο χρόνο. Άρα λοιπόν ένα σημαντικό ζήτημα, αυτή η λατρεία τέλος πάντων η αναφορά στους προπάτορες είναι πολύ σημαντική και είναι ένα από τα ζητήματα τα οποία κλήθηκαν να αντιμετωπίσουν και οι χριστιανικές ιεραποστολές όταν οι οποίες βρίσκονται στην Αφρική. Και ένα άλλο σημείο, έτσι, ενδεικτικά πάλι θα αναφερθώ σε αυτά, είναι η σχέση πολιτιστικών τελετουργικών πρακτικών με τη θρησκεία και ενδεχομένως με κάποιες συνιστώσεις μεταφυσικού περιεχομένου. Έτσι λοιπόν, για παράδειγμα, η θρησκευτική πρακτική των Ρασταφαριανών, αν είναι σωστή μετάφραση στα ελληνικά, που διεκδικούν το δικαίωμα να καπνίζουν κάναβη ως μέρος του θρησκευτικού τελετουργικού τους, έχει δημιουργήσει ακόμα και δικαστικές διενέξεις, οι οποίες βέβαια κατέληξαν ακόμα και στα δικαστήρια, γιατί είναι και θέμα δικαιωμάτων, ενώ στα διοικητικά δικαστήρια, γιατί είχε να κάνει και με ένα διοικητικό χαρακτήρα, άρνηση εργασίας για παράδειγμα σε έναν δικηγόρο να ενταχθεί στον δικηγορικό σύλλογο, επειδή ακριβώς ανήκε σε αυτή την ομάδα. Επίσης, η πιο γνωστή ενδεχομένως πρακτική, η οποία έχει και αυτή μια κοινωνική και μια θρησκευτική διάκριση, είναι ο περίφημος ακροτηριασμός των γυναικείων γενετικών οργάνων, οι οποίες βέβαια υπάρχουν σε κάποιες κοινότητες της Αφρικής, και οι οποίες όμως στις περισσότερες αφρικανικές χώρες καταδικάζονται και είναι παράνομες. Τόσο υπάρχει πάντα αυτή η σύγκρουση μεταξύ της ηθικής, η οποία εκφράζεται μέσα από τις παραδοσιακές λατρείες, και η σύγκρουση τόσο με την χριστιανική, ας το πούμε, ηθική, αλλά και με το νομικό πλαίσιο, το σύγχρονο νομικό πλαίσιο και τα ανθρώπινα δικαιώματα.
Κύριε Πρόεδρε,
ναι.
Έχουμε φτάσει στα 25 λεπτά. Είναι πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέροντα αυτά που μας λέτε, αλλά σιγά σιγά λίγο κάπως να οδηγηθούμε στα συμπεράσματα.
Μάλιστα. Δεν κατάλαβα ότι πέρασε ο χρόνος, έχετε δίκιο. Λοιπόν, θα ελπίζω στην κουβέντα. Θα κλείσω με ένα χαρακτηριστικό, γιατί απόσπασμα από το Σύνταγμα της Ζάμπια. Συνήθως συζητάμε στην Ελλάδα για το προήμιο του Συντάγματος και για την αφορά στην Αγία Τριάδα. Το ίδιο πρόβλημα έχουν και στη Ζάμπια. Και γιατί το επέλεξα το παράδειγμα? Γιατί συνήθως λέμε ότι η Αφρική είναι ένας άλλος κόσμος. Ναι, είναι ένας άλλος κόσμος, ωστόσο κάποια ζητήματα τα οποία αφορούν την σχέση θρησκείας και πολιτικής, τα ανθρώπινα δικαιώματα, μπορεί να είναι κοινά σε βαθμό που δεν θα το περιμέναμε, έτσι. Λέει, για παράδειγμα, εμείς ο λαός της Ζάμπιας αναγνωρίζουμε την υπεροχή του παντοδύναμου Θεού. Δηλώνουμε ότι είμαστε ένα χριστιανικό έθνος, ενώ υποστηρίζουμε το δικαίωμα ενός ατόμου στην ελευθερία του, τη συνείδηση, την πεποίθηση, την ελευθερία της συνείδησης, της πεποίθησης και της θρησκείας. Υπερασπίζουμε τα δικαιώματα των ανθρώπων και τις θεμελιώδεις ελευθερίες κάθε ατόμου. Δεσμευόμαστε να τηρούμε τις αρχές της δημοκρατίας και της χρηστής διακυβέρνησης. Αποφασίζουμε να διασφαλίσουμε ότι οι αξίες μας σχετίζονται με την οικογένεια, την ηθική, τον πατριωτισμό και τη δικαιοσύνη, και οι λειτουργίες του κράτους εκτελούνται προς το κοινό μας συμφέρον. Επιβεβαιώνουμε την ίση αξία γυναικών και ανδρών και το δικαίωμά τους να συμμετέχουν ελεύθερα και να καθορίζουν, να οικοδομούν μια βιώσιμη πολιτική, μια δικαιική, οικονομική και κοινωνική τάξη. Αναγνωρίζουμε τα πολυεθνικά, πολυφιλετικά, πολυθρησκευτικά και πολυπολιτιστικά στοιχεία του έθνους μας και το δικαίωμά μας να διαχειριζόμαστε τις υποθέσεις και τους πόρους μας βιώσιμα σε ένα αποκεντρωμένο σύστημα διακυβέρνησης. Λοιπόν, έτσι θα ήθελα να κλείσω λέγοντας ακριβώς πως στοιχεία και προβλήματα τα οποία αντιμετωπίζουμε εμείς στην Ευρώπη σε ένα βαθμό είναι κοινά με αυτά που αντιμετωπίζουν οι χώρες της Αφρικής. Φαίνεται αυτό μέσα από τα συντάγματά τους, φαίνεται αυτό μέσα από την νομοθεσία τους, φαίνεται μέσα από τη δομή των δικαστηρίων τους, στην προσπάθειά τους να αλλάξουν, να προχωρήσουν και κοινωνικά και πολιτικά και οικονομικά. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
We thank you, Professor Magyaros. If I may just to sum up in a few words, because what I have recalled, it was a very interesting presentation of the prognostics of religion in Africa from the Pew Center in the year 2050, that you see a geometrical increase in Christians and even greater among Muslims, while a lesser increase rate in traditional African religions and a decline in Judaism. That religion the concept of religion is not the same as we understand it in the European area, but still there is a significant discussion about the role of religion in the public sphere, trying to bring together traditional elements and modernization. So you referred to plenty of different examples about constitutional laws and court decisions that show how they balance among different priorities. And so we can see that part of our problems that we face with religion in the public sphere are also common despite the differences and despite the fact that religion is deeply rooted. Religion, culture, and politics are very tightly linked in Africa. I do not know if I felt like I needed to say a few words in English for our English-speaking guests. If I have not managed so very well, you will explain during discussion. We will have questions to clarify everything. So I now move on to Professor Nektarios Polychroniou, adjunct professor at the Hellenic American University. Well, he's here under many capacities, so I had just a selective approach that he is a consul of the Republic of Botswana in Greece. So he has also practical ties with an African country and very close relations to the Patriarchate. Professor Polychroniou would have been normally here with us because he lives in Athens, but he has caught a cold and we don't know what kind of cold so far. So he's also online with us. So since we have opened up this possibility, we are very close to one another, although remotely. So the floor is yours. Oh, professors, excuse me, just he is going to present us a very interesting point that was raised also by President and Professor Nikos Magioros, the influence of immigration. And he will see this from a business point of view and from an African perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you for your kind invitation and for putting together this very interesting conference, specialized in Africa. It was much needed, I think. Indeed, I wanted to be physically present today, as I am in Athens, but in the COVID era, if you have a flu, first of all, you don't know if you have a negative, if the negative test is always a negative, and also if you dare to cough publicly, then you get the looks or social distancing. So I think it's always better to avoid this situation. I will try to cut short my presentation because you know, last panel always gets it with time constraints. So I will try to keep it as short as possible. The purpose of my today's presentation is to briefly outline the connection between immigration and business activity, and more specifically to examine whether the expansion of business opportunities in Africa may become a factor that might decrease emigration from Africa. And to this end, how global organizations such as the Orthodox Church in Africa through the Patriarchate of Alexandria may drive this factor. There is one question that requires an urgent and sincere response. That is there a way to shoot down those Africans that are willing to risk their lives by taking on a dangerous trip across borders, through treacherous waters and life-threatening situations? Because even those who survive this journey and are not sent back may come to realize that life is not as expected across the frontier. At a time of peace, one of the primary reasons for becoming a labor migrant is economic opportunity. This opportunity is absent in the immigrants' countries or is perceived as such. The challenge is to create this opportunity within the borders, within their homes. This is paramount for the added reason that Africa's population, as Professor Magioros said, will be doubled within the next 30 years. So as the immigration flow will be more than double in case things do not change. The role of business and entrepreneurship in tackling immigration is crucial. Business development positively affects the overall economic climate of a country, but it also affects the lives of the individuals. Imagine a young African that has long been looking for a job unsuccessfully. He is contemplating to flee to other destinations. One day, he becomes part of the development of an innovative business idea. His engagement provides financial stability to him and his family, as well as professional accomplishment. Shortly after, his life has changed. He doesn't need to flee anymore. Unemployment, indeed, is one of the major challenges, and especially within the context of population increase. Governments and organizations may stem the flow of immigrants by putting together policy for the development of businesses and the creation of jobs. However, over the last decades, the effort of several African countries to tackle unemployment was not successful, despite the structural adjustment policies recommended by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The United Nations Economic Commission for Africa has indicated that job creation policies should focus on labor-intensive sectors, such as agriculture. However, jobs being created in agriculture are in the informal economy at low levels of productivity and failing to supply the workers with adequate resources. On the other hand, business innovation, in balance with sustainable development, may create wealth and jobs, not only in agriculture. With the advancement of science and technology, technological innovation has also grown. Innovations may compensate for structural challenges, such as inefficient distribution of goods, inadequate waste management, or unreliable energy infrastructure. Let me give you some figures here. African technological startups received more than $560 million of investment in 2017. That was a new record back then. While in 2018, the number of internet users increased by more than 20%. Africa is adopting leapfrog technologies and may become a global leader in cutting-edge technologies, initiating centers of innovation, and promoting capacity building for the local population. However, despite the rising number of users, internet penetration rate was at around 43% in 2021, which is below a global average of 66%. Youth entrepreneurship. The role of youth entrepreneurship in battling youth migration is important. There has been some significant discussion that we need to implement a new Marshall Plan for African youth that represents the future of the continent. Young people should be incentivized to reform their countries through business activity. Private investors should be invited by proper policies and incentives to support youth entrepreneurship. International as well as regional organizations should further push for reform. The aim is to progress, considering Africa's tradition, its special patterns of development, and its intracontinental pluralism and diversity. Africa is not one country, but several stakeholders tend to forget this fact. Another most important element is women's empowerment. That goes side by side with youth empowerment. Sadly, a contributory factor to the increase of African immigration is, in several cases, the position of women in the society. According to the United Nations, the majority of women and girls being trafficked all over the world come from Africa. The factors that prevent women from being strong, educated, and empowered must be eliminated. Women should be granted a genuine opportunity for self-improvement, boost their self-esteem, and encourage them to occupy more leading positions in business and politics. Some examples of women empowerment are in the beef farming industry. In Ethiopia, for instance, which is one of the biggest producers of honey in the world, has implemented policies giving access to funds and land to women entrepreneurs. In Kenya, beef farming sector attracted approximately 50% of women. In Botswana, basket weaving for commercial exploitation has been traditionally done by women. In Nigeria, women recently came to occupy more than 30% of parliament seats, due to political reforms supported by UNDP, ranking first in the Arab world. There is a term, ladies and gentlemen, in business theory called disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation. The term refers to the creation of a new market and the value network that eventually disrupts an existing market, displacing established market-leading firms, products, services, alliances. The term was first analyzed by Clayton Christensen in 1995 and has been called the most influential business idea of the early 21st century, disruptive innovation. I personally believe that disruptive innovation has a twofold implementation field in Africa towards battling immigration through business. First, and I refer to this term literally, through leapfrog technologies or in the field of services, business disruption will create development, tackle unemployment, build capacity to youth, and bring a proactive mentality to the society. Secondly, referring to the term metaphorically, policies and organizations like the Patriarchate of Alexandria should redirect their efforts and mentality from poverty alleviation to wealth creation. Funding shall be used to lift Africans out of poverty through capacity building schemes, innovative entrepreneurial policies, and respective education. After all, despite the trillions of dollars in aid that have been infused in Africa in the last decades, millions of people continue to immigrate and suffer. International and regional organizations and religious institutions need to identify a common strategy towards promoting sustainable development through business activity, focusing on Africa's needs. European Union, as one of the top listed destinations of immigration from Africa, should set an example by proposing and implementing a comprehensive strategy for sustainable business development. EU policies should aim at capacity building. As an example of such a policy, I refer to the Archipelago project, which is an economic project that focuses on the increase of youth and vulnerable groups' employability. This is done by providing professional training to private sector needs and by adopting partnership projects in several African countries between European and African business membership organizations. The aim here is to provide technical and vocational education and training according to labor needs at sectors with development potentials. The means to achieve this is by promoting entrepreneurial skills, small and medium-sized enterprises, and future startups. Startups are closely connected with innovation and disruption, disruptive innovation, as I was referring earlier. Policies such as the Archipelago Project aim at combating unemployment and immigration. Projects like this will set the example. Religious institutions should play a role towards business development. After all, and I'm wrapping up this presentation, my idea is that religious missions in Africa are very important. The provision of financial aid to Africans in need is of utmost importance. The creation of orphanages and nursing homes indeed serve local societies. Building churches, spreading the word of God is the core mandate of a religious institution. However, I would like to stress out that without abolishing, of course, the above core action plan and the mandate of the religious character of a religious institution. I think that the religious institutions in Africa will need to add new groundbreaking approaches. They will need to support new entrepreneurs in a world full of unemployment. An example of such action plan could be the establishment of a network that will support micro entrepreneurs. With the help of volunteers, a church could offer capacity building in the form of business training programs to local African prospective micro-entrepreneurs, workshops, one-on-one mentoring, even microloans to support a business launch. Helping others to achieve.
Excuse me, Professor, we are beyond our time. So if you could sum up your main points.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was the conclusion. The main point was the church could facilitate a scheme where business activity would be also built through the church's presence in Africa. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. You've touched very interesting issues. Some of them have been touched during our morning and yesterday session in different ways. We discussed the issue of education, also gender equality and opportunities for women. You also stressed women trafficking. We also, I'm sorry, because in the room they don't hear me. I forgot the other microphone because we also have students present here. So we have also been discussing the possibilities and of the church to do the ecumenical work along with mission, and how much, what the priorities should be, the role of education to liberate people. And so I think this business approach is very useful. But I think the next presentation will be to a certain part contradictory, to another part complementary, because it raises some question about wealth and money and the accumulation of wealth and environmental issues. So I would like to welcome Professor John Bonk. Thank you very much for being us. It's an honor that you are here and while traveling. It's early morning in the US, so good morning to you. And
morning.
We expect you to raise a more critical approach to the issue of mission and money, discussing the African paradigm, as we know from your books you have been doing. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. If you notice, there's a little bit of ambient noise around me. I'm sitting in a restaurant. My wife and I are on our way from Winnipeg to visit our grandchildren in New Haven, Connecticut. And the motel Wi-Fi is too slow. So I came into the restaurant, I asked, can I have a table? And they said, yes, you may. So I'm sitting in a restaurant listening to background music and so on. I'm going to try to be as brief as I can because I sent two texts to Eva. Thank you, Eva, for organizing this. And thank you very much for the invitation. I really feel out of my league in some ways. You are such practical, good people. And as an older professor, maybe I've become a little cranky with old age, maybe a little more pessimistic than I should be. My background, of course, is African. I grew up in Africa. Most of my first language was an African language. And I returned to Africa with great frequency because of the work that I was involved in with the Dictionary of African Christian Biography. And the first 300 stories in the dictionary were, not surprisingly, the stories of Orthodox Christians, because they were the first ones, Africans, to become strongly Christian. But aside from that, I would like to make several general points. I want to remind us that in my observation, I've traveled to most African countries. Africans tend to be quite entrepreneurial, and they find ways of surviving even at the grassroots. Some of my earliest memories as a boy growing up in Ethiopia were of very entrepreneurial little children my age selling matches or selling cigarettes on the sidewalk in an attempt to survive. So they have a kind of, I find across Africa, great streams of entrepreneurial energy. Secondly, I often remind myself that the economic structures in Africa have their roots in colonialism. And the countries in Africa don't exist because Africans decided to form countries. They exist because Europeans decided to partition Africa and to create a series of entities that would be to the advantage of the colonizing countries. Although they use the language of civilization, they really did very little to civilize. Not only that, sometimes the colonization process was absolutely brutal, sometimes conspicuously brutal, as in the case of Congo, but always with an advantage to the colonizing country, to the economic advantage. This, we have to remember, has metamorphosed into what today we call globalization. So in globalization, the Western economies, particularly the American one, more or less dictates the terms. And the Africans have to fit in as best they can to survive on other people's terms. So what I am doing then this morning is simply asking 3 questions. I'm not going to give a paper. You have the text of my paper, at least Eva does, and so I won't. First of all, I think we need to ask questions about development. How did the West come to be developed? Sometimes we hear often, as our professor was mentioning, the admirable goal of sustainable development. Development is intrinsically unsustainable. If I look at the United States, my wife and I drove down from Canada, we drive through these empty towns with boarded up stores. They're at the mercy of capitalism, and capitalism simply destroys and moves on to bigger things. And so we need to know what we're talking about when we talk about sustainable development. But anyway, having said that, my question is, how did the West come to be developed? How did the West economically and socially become accustomed to being in the driver's seat of the world's economies as innovators, as envied exemplars, as purveyors of a way of life that missionaries often used to use as Exhibit A in their arsenal of proofs that their way of life was superior to the African way of life, and that the American way of life was essentially rooted in the Bible, which is not really true, but that was the idea. We can no longer be so sanguine about the comfortable way of life that issues from the West's development recipes. We now recognize that our planet can't survive the avarice that lies at its root, the continual desire for more. This is an ethos that's built into its DNA, and we now see it's stripping the planet of non-renewable resources. It's contaminating rivers, oceans, exterminating species, and guaranteeing an atmosphere that will suffocate life forms such as human beings. That's not really development. That's something else. That's what I would call predatory consumerism. So that's my question. How did the West come to be developed? I could say more about that, I won't. Question number 2, should the Western way of consumption be emulated by Africans and Asians, subscribing to our way of life. That's a dangerous one to me. And I say it even though I'm an active participant in this way of life, I know nothing else. I only know there's problems, but I don't know what the answer is because the civilization is too big. I'm too small. And I raise questions so that I develop a language for talking about it critically and thinking about it critically, particularly theologically. I think only theology is big enough to actually frame these kinds of issues. The world cannot afford a human population that consumes and pollutes at the same level as do nations who have adopted capitalism or Marxism or some other economic model of infinite economic growth through ever increasing human consumption of goods, services, non-renewable raw materials. North America, in its present political and social forms, it must never be forgotten, was born and sustained through great evils. The greatest genocide in the history of human genocides, followed by the most egregious form of human slavery ever practiced, was all justified and sustained to this day by a system of laws and practices that obliterate or disenfranchise the vanquished and once enslaved. Which other nation in the world today can adopt such practices as they embark on their path to so-called development? And yet genocide and slavery are foundational to the stories of the United States and Canada. And we who live in the West, or who are its economic and military satellites, are beneficiaries of evils that can never be undone and that should never be emulated. So when we point to ourselves as an example of entrepreneurial success, we have to remember, first of all, there were waves of European migrants, beginning 500 years ago in the tens, then in the hundreds, then in the thousands, then in the millions, that completely swamped the North American and South American continents and developed what we now think of as developed nations. Today, migration is in reverse. Europeans are not the ones who are migrating unless their countries at war, but Africans are migrating, as we've heard. And of course they're migrating because when people are in terrible situations, they want to go somewhere where there's hope. The third question I'll raise, and then I'll come to a conclusion, has to do with the overconsumption, the impact of overconsumption on the planet's environment. We are entering a period of instability and unpredictability as the planet warms, as glaciers and ice caps melt, as oceans acidify and rise, and entire populations either migrate or die. The empty way of life that we have inherited from our forefathers have produced this inevitable result. And Icelander Andri Snær Magnusson helps us to grasp the immensity of this problem. And I quote from him: "Scientists have shown us that the foundations of life, of Earth itself, are failing. The principal ideologies of the 20th century considered the Earth and nature as sources of inexpensive, infinite raw material. Humans assumed that the atmosphere could continually absorb emissions, that oceans could continually absorb waste, that soil could constantly renew itself if given more fertilizer and chemicals, that animal species would keep moving aside as human beings colonized more and more space," end quote. Now, my question is, what effect should this inescapable reality have on theology and the theology of development, the theology of sustainable development, on the very idea of mission? I have to confess that we're like fish who can't live without being in water, but who are not really capable of comprehending the nature of their environment beyond that it is an indispensable condition of life. So we as human beings today live and move in a social and economic environment that we barely understand and which is beyond our capacity to control, even when we become aware of the fatal impact of our way of life on our own survival. So we don't have an answer to this question as far as I know. It is an ongoing question. It's a systemic question. And whether or not we find answers, the questions arising from this dawning reality will remain. I confess that it's a gloomy story, although within it, there are many, many positive things. But overall, it's a gloomy story as we see oceans rising, deserts forming, ice melting, species extinguishing. And make no mistake, Christian mission in its Western manifestations and models is very much part of the problem, not the solution, in my view. And we ourselves have to know what it means to live differently. And at the moment, we don't. And perhaps Africans, perhaps African theologians who tap into their Old Testaments, the way in which God has prepared them to receive the gospel. Perhaps as they tap into some of those sources, they'll have theologies and practical theologies that enable them to grapple with these things in ways that our Western theologies have not been capable of doing. So that is my question. I think 1,000 years from now, people will look back at our Western societies and say they called that development. Destroying the planet is development. Polluting the atmosphere, suffocating the fish, etc. That's development. It's not. But perhaps they will say this was the greatest period of human regression in the history of the human species. I don't know. I sound pretty negative, but then I'm 77 years old, so I can be excused for being a little cranky at times. But thank you very much. I think there's lots there for discussion, and I thank you for inviting me to be part of this.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Jonathan. You spoke of predatory consumerism. And I have a joke for you. It's a joke from reality. There is a big discussion in the Greek public sphere about the surveillance system, because it seems that the government, or the deep state, as we say it, has co-listened to politicians. And they have used a system that is called Predator. But somehow, most journalists were talking about the system, and they were repeatedly saying, Predator, Predator. And I was scratching my head, you know, what is this Predator? Are they preparing for a date? Is in their mind some kind of foreplay for something nice? What do they have in mind? They refuse this predatory nature of some of our actions. So I also feel like a fish, like making bubbles without saying something of consistency with regard to those problems. I do not know how to deal it. It's the word capitalism. It's a very, very huge problems. And yet I think we should raise these questions. And I'm now looking forward to Jean Komarov, who will bring us in her wisdom about New Protestantism. Dear Jean, this is a question that peculiarly enough has been raised quite a lot during our morning and yesterday's session, because everybody who observes the environment around sees that there is this kind of Protestantism rising very quickly and very high. There are all these movements, and I'm expecting a lot from your presentation, which is also the last presentation. Then we have a discussion and closure. about religion and capitalism and social and spiritual elements in Africa. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. I think this follows in some ways from the papers that have gone before, but in many ways it's about what I would call neoliberalism, Christianity, and the way that Africans have responded to precisely the circumstances that Professor Bonk has noted. The massive growth of evangelical churches across much of the world in recent times is especially significant and ironic from the African perspective. It's not merely that these movements confirm the enduring and even intensifying importance of the sacred in our world, north, south, east, and west, a fact that defies many of the predictions of disenchantment presumed by the great evolutionary theorists of modernity. It's also that the forms of religious life that have proved most adaptive to current social conditions in Africa defy many of the tenets of Protestant modernism as promulgated by the likes of, say, Max Weber, or the bulk of the driving 19th century colonial evangelists. What is more, these movements have been self-propagating in a manner that eluded many of the most laborious efforts to plant Christianity on African soil, like the attempt of the European civilizing missions to cultivate self-possessed African converts and to ensure salvation through patient labor. The kind of a church that appeals most evidently to African sensibilities in the present is of another sort. As in many parts of the world, from the US to the Ukraine, from Sao Paulo to Seoul, the Pentecostal movements that have grown most luxuriantly across much of the African continent in recent times promote conceptions of belief, personhood, and emotion that contrast markedly with mainstream Protestant modernism. These born-again faiths have affinities with indigenous forms of African religion, to be sure, forms that have long contested African Christianity and remade it in independent ways, particularly as it was linked to colonialism. They also have links to more homegrown apocalyptic movements of an earlier vintage that sparked in African context in the early 20th century revivalism, and it was promoted by the effects of American revivalism, both black and white, like the Zionist churches in South Africa or the Watchtower movement in the Rhodesias or Nyasaland. Indeed, such resemblances have suggested that some Pentecostal awakenings should be understood first and foremost in terms of a distinctly local African religiosity. But the shape and the scale and the self-consciousness of the most recent Pentecostal movements in Africa also share features of similar developments elsewhere in the world, features that the likes of David Martin insist are profoundly contemporary and linked to the kind of global economy that we've just been hearing. And while they assert a foundationalism of a kind, these churches also tend to be outspokenly opposed to African tradition per se, although while they are strong in that opposition, they underline its power. And a lot of this has to do with the relationship of religion and prosperity. In fact, what these movements stress is less the unbroken continuity with indigenous forms of belief than a self-conscious born-again return to fundamentals. And in this, their faith seems of a distinctly late modern kind, striving to be totalizing, yet also being locked in the struggle against falsity, deception, doubt, and failure. Such belief is late modern also in the way that it operates. In Africa as elsewhere, it puts trust in an electronically enabled millennium, a digitally enhanced sense of miracle, televised intimacies, mass-mediated communions, all the better to restore a sense of the return to original oneness with the divine power. In their tendency to address localized spiritual desires through technologically mediated global forms, these movements seem to be quintessentially neo, in the kind of neoliberal sense of the world order. More than this, in many places, they serve to tune local desires to larger scale aspirations, even projects of transformation, although they're much more entrepreneurial, I would suggest, than they are millennial. But they also differ from these movements in telling ways. For if the complexity of self-consciously born-again faiths cannot be explained in terms of local African tradition alone, they also defy many of the conventional theories of religious modernity as enshrined, as I've said, in the work of, for instance, Weber and the Protestant ethic, the spirit of capitalism. The kind of belief represented by what are sometimes called neo-Pentecostal movements, like the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, to which I'll talk below, differ in crucial ways from this idea of the modern Protestantism. Originally from Brazil, but now one of the fastest growing organizations in South Central regions of Africa, the Universal Church propagates a kind of media-savvy, emotionally hyped, frankly materialist brand of faith that contrasts sharply with the idea of asceticism, this worldly asceticism. It presumes a rather different social institutional framework, being oriented to different kinds of person, family, and enterprise in the world, indeed business. Yet this contemporary brand of Protestantism, I would suggest, is no less integrally connected to the spirit of capitalism than was the earlier form that Weber talked about, although it is a capitalism of a late modern, often post-industrial phase. Yeah. In fact, the Universal Church and movements like it have a great deal to teach us in the current epoch in Africa and beyond about the way that the kind of desires that drive this form of religion. Why is it that these forms of social organization have succeeded when so many others fail, where characteristically modern institutions, in fact, have faltered? How might it serve as a medium of social transformation, world building, when older forms of state-centered economy and development have significant decline? And this is something that I think that we need to acknowledge. That model has failed. The sacred has become increasingly prominent in profane places in many parts of Africa. Jesus is the answer, declares a large sign on the highway to Sun City, one of South Africa's most famous casinos, northwest of Johannesburg. Elsewhere in Cape Town, there's a tremendous populist concern with the presence of Jesus. Cape Town for Jesus, the final countdown, tickets available. There are huge gatherings of people that gather together to see this kind of effervescence and the hope it brings. There are the evangelical street sweepers in overalls called God's cleaners, who sweep outside the streets of Cape Town these days, outside mosques, churches, and so on. And there are swelling evangelical congregations that hold services in shopping malls and amphitheaters. Like their counterparts elsewhere, they avoid traditional religious symbols. They have no steeples, no bell towers, no arches, no crucifixes. And in fact, they look much more like performing arts centers or community colleges or even corporate headquarters. And in fact, that's a lot of the kind of activity that they seek to drive. In similar spirits, cutting-edge congregations use slick web pages and Facebook profiles, reach out in ways that shun poverty entirely, and offer new places of self-discovery, where they say you can make new connections, you can even have fun. Faith-based groups, in other words, are ever more assertively reaching into mundane registers of everyday life, into business, education, politics, popular entertainment, even if they do so in domains that were formerly not seen to be the domains of the religious. So the religious organizations are really out there in a way. Neither is this merely, of course, an African phenomenon. In England and the US, Pentecostal corporations run a growing number of privatized prisons. In Africa, mega churches have become sites where Wall Street meets the pulpit, where pastors and CEOs talk about gospel entrepreneurialism and sound business practice. Many of them see this, in fact, as inseparable from their religious calling. These churches are already there. It seems that no instrument is too profane to act as a vehicle for salvation, rendering more and more ambiguous the key dimensions of the theological architecture of liberal Western modernity. They are eroding the line between the sacred and the secular everywhere. Now, none of these dimensions are particularly new. The stress laid in the modern West on the separation of the sacred and the profane, of church and state, has always been undermined in practice and is particularly limited in its appeal beyond the West. But by the end of the 20th century, received divisions among government, market, and church have been under siege everywhere. There is a blurring of the domains, and it takes different institutional forms in different contexts in Euro-America. The shift has been associated with the impact of deregulation and privatization and the kind of demise of the Keynesian state and the great public institutions of prison, health care, schooling, and government administration. In Africa, the fragile civic structure of many post-colonial states has been fractured by the effects of structural adjustment policies and the demise, the end of state-centered models of development and care redistribution. Post-apartheid South Africa, from which many of my examples are drawn, this is where I was also raised myself, post-apartheid South Africa combines many of these tendencies, although there still is something of a memory of struggles past and a role for organized labor in the state government that puts a brake on these neoliberal effects. But these shifts also bear striking similarities to changes taking place elsewhere, and they talk, therefore, to more epochal transformations. And one of the points I want to make is a lot of what we're seeing in Africa in heightened form is part of a very global set of processes that we are looking at elsewhere. For instance, the growth of the informal economy, which you're now told by the EU is the new normal in the West as well. Most immediately, they resemble processes occurring in contexts that have also undergone dramatic regime change in recent years. If you look at what's going on in Eastern Europe and Latin America, you see many of these things going on. Regions where new democracies have had to establish themselves against strong pressures towards state deregulation, and where the global processes of so-called development have driven markets and commodification. But the changes in religious life that one observes in places like South Africa seem to be even more widely distributed than this. In fact, the embrace of Pentecostal faith against much of the world seems to have been accompanied by 20th century processes of politico-economic liberalization. But the way that they relate to each other is not that easy to understand. So how do we think about this? They go together, but what is the role, cause and effect? How do they work? While many have remarked the growing commitment across the world to ideologies and policies vested in the logic of the market, fewer have noted the strong, apparently contradictory train that has gone along with this, a new sense of the force of divine destiny in human affairs. Theological politics, which was a concern after all of 17th century rationalists like Spinoza, is again a lively reality in many places. Indeed, amidst a flourishing of faiths of all types, the role of liberal humanism, what Talal Assad called the modern project, has been ever more assertively brought into question, largely in the name of revealed truths and godly imperatives. These challenges have been explicitly framed in some places in opposition to notions of the secular. In fact, a deep suspicion of social relativist humanist understanding is shared by many faiths, foundational faiths and creeds across the world. There are connections here to the concerns of other opponents of liberal humanism, from neoconservatives to market fundamentalists. The latter also are open to asserting the end of history, the treachery of philosophy, and they look for very fundamental kind of readings in law and in religion. And if you think about the way that American constitutionalism and the American Supreme Court is working right now and its religious directives, you see how this is the case. A related aspect in this current revitalization of faith, also in tension with the modernist project, is the growing salience of revelation as a legitimate basis for truth and action and the interpretation of events. Modern liberal theology might talk about the difference between the separation between church and state, but organized religion and the dictates of faith play an ever larger role in the workings of government. In addition, a host of born-again believers across the world choose to suspend free faith often when convicted by divine authority, manifest in a rather different form of religion and the ideas of the working of the world. Pentecostal movements do not merely question from below the tenets of liberal modernity and its ways of knowing and being. They aim also to counter the institutional arrangements that have nurtured the modern worldview. And this is where their sociological dimension becomes evident. In late modern times, born-again faiths have tended to strive in various ways to reshape the modern order of things, to challenge the authority and the neutrality of state law and the secularism of the market. The task, as Ted Haggart, former president of the National Association of Evangelists in the US, put it, is to put God in everything so that everything can be holy. This totalizing ambition of many Pentecostal movements has special salience for the widespread deregulation, and not only, but particularly in Africa. At a time when, under the sway of neoliberal policies, many states have relinquished responsibility for schooling, health, and welfare. In short, for the social reproduction of their citizens, religious organizations have willingly reclaimed that role, a role never fully lost in many places to the great disciplinary institutions of the welfare state. The recent expansion of faith-based services in healthcare, for instance, or Islamic charity on the African continent, challenge the separation of powers that underlie the ideals, if not always the practices, of 20th century liberal democracies. So churches are doing a tremendous amount of where the state has pulled back. They're doing the work. In fact, organized religion has made a vital place for itself in the domain of politics, market, the mass media. Ever more so, it is taking over their work. I noted this implies a shift in the division of labor that was underlying modern secular societies, the kinds of visions provided by Durkheim and Weber. But it also diverges from this idea of established Protestantism, which it does not like the blurring of the distinction between the sacred and the secular, or the state and the church. This was the view held by civilizing missions in much of indigenous Africa, where there was a resistance to the kind of indigenization, the creolization of Christianity, and where the kind of pragmatic healing that it inspired, or the holistic care that it provided, was seen to be syncretistic or a bridge back to heathenism. So there's been a resistance to this humanizing of the church by many mission organizations, but nevertheless it's continued. These days, Pentecostal holism is especially vibrant in the global south, where it ranges in scale from mega movements of the huge churches that you see, like the Redeemed Church in Nigeria, or tremendously large churches in places like South Korea, to small and independent movements that are visible in African shanty towns and in the favelas of Latin America. So an example of the kind that I have studied in my work is called the New Life Church in Mafeking in South Africa. Yeah. And it's an organization that, like many of them, were branded by new kind of neo-Pentecostal movements in the US, this from the New Life Church in Colorado. So this church kind of typifies a kind of upbeat technological faith that that seeks to fill the moral void, the void of morality that was left with the withering of old civic norms in the post-colony. What was left in the post-colonial world was a kind of moral vacuum often. These congregations are part of a global network, and they mix a kind of lively, charismatic realism with frank materiality. They talk to people's desires for successful business, yeah, and they're very comfortable with this. The church offers everything from marriage guidance to financial counseling to microloans, at the same time as they do things like AIDS and pandemic outreach. And they see this as a kind of service-oriented role of the church. And the pastor says, this might sound heretical, but we strive to make worship exciting and affecting. Our competition is the video arcade and the casino, but we also seek above all to give people practical hope. In New Life's, their religious sanctuary, they don't have an altar. They have a large screen, yeah, which looks like karaoke or PowerPoint, and it flashes hymns and advertisements and sort of models of past success of members of the congregation across the screen. And here you see a membership that draws in South Africa across the lines of race and even class. It's pulling people together into these kind of cycles of hope. As this example underscores, mass media have played a vital role in extending the influence of revitalized faith in this world, not just because such media amplify the scale and speed and directness of address, but because they become integral to the way in which revelation and religion itself stages itself. People understand faith through mass mediation and the kind of ecstasy that it can bring. To a large extent, radio, TV, and the internet have come to shape the way that the sacred is witnessed in much of Africa. Of course, mass media have always been used to spread the word. The advent of the printing press, evangelists in Africa used things like the magic lantern and various kinds of ways of film, movies. But at the same time, the reach of popular religious broadcasting today seems unprecedented. In Africa, transnational, evangelical, and Muslim groups are taking advantage of deregulation of state media to build broadcast enterprises that impact powerfully on the circulation of images and the creation of subjects and publics. The means of communication in general are ever more under the control of faith-based corporations. And religious media conduct a growing proportion of business on the African continent. These are huge industries. The Nollywood film industry is one of the biggest in the world. It is owned by Pentecostals. And there is the circulation of cassettes of sermons, gospel CDs, even the baraka of sheikhs in West Africa is being circulated through these media. So the qualities displayed by these revitalized faiths are both old and new. And they are thoroughly domesticated in the African context. Movements of this kind hardly exhaust the contemporary religious terrain, but older established denominations that tend to question their values and motives have had to respond to their stunning success and their modus operandi, particularly among the young. And these vast generations of unemployed young people are incredibly drawn to these movements. So they are a means to be used. How then do we make sense of this exuberant new Christianity in these times? What constitutes its particular break with the past? Talal Asad, the anthropologist of religion, has argued that the process of drawing the line between the sacred and the secular was essential to the ideology of modern liberal states and their modes of governance. Shifts in the nature of the state might well be implicated then in the kind of boundary-breaking rise of Pentecostalism. But as I've suggested, there's also a widespread popular impetus in the early 21st century to redefine the place of religion in the civic order, a widespread effort to rediscover a sense of authenticity, a kind of sovereign authority in the world, the power that religion can provide. And in Africa, that power has always been associated with the capacity in this world to generate wealth. So there's thorough transformation going on here. And the character of
Professor Komarov, we are beyond 5:30.
Yes, okay. Would you like me to end, or do you would just read?
I'll just give you a few minutes to conclude.
Okay. Max Weber argued that the Protestant ethic had made holy the maximizing ethos of early industrial society. And it nurtured the kinds of cultural orientations that made capitalism flourish. Are we just seeing in Africa and the wider world another chapter in this long story, this effective relationship between now evangelicalism and neoliberal capitalism? I would say yes and no. The relationship, and we can go into this in another time, is much more complicated than Weber was talking about, because there's never been a disenchantment, I would say, and the relationship between religion and capitalism has always been ongoing, being remade in local times and places. But the kind of Protestant faith that we see now in vogue across Africa has in a sense been integral also, not just to the image that comes from capitalism, from Protestantism as an encouragement towards prosperity. But what I've been trying to suggest here is these churches have taken on within themselves the very forms that deregulated modern capitalism imply. And they've used them in various sorts of creative ways. Mm-hmm. And I think before we are too quick to condemn, we have to ask why they have been so massively powerful, how they have built out these complex forms of attending to social need. By the way, many of them are migrant churches too. And what we can learn from them, their capacity, if you like, to invoke energy and promise, and how we can direct this possibly to some of the sorts of issues that we've raised here. So there are theoretical questions for us to try and understand the success, see what it's doing, see where in fact we feel that it resonates with what might be the sorts of goals one would like to see achieved, and where indeed it raises warning bells that it might be a repetition of the older kind of forms of capitalist development that, as I agree with Professor Bonk, have been so destructive on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this presentation was a fine presentation to conclude, although it opened up immense topics that we really need to enhance our understanding. It also linked with the first presentation of Professor Majoros as to the evolution of religion within modernity and within the public sphere, and how religion takes up deregulation, capitalism, and etc. This was very interesting. I still, as a theologian, because I'm not a social scientist, I'm not, I haven't studied economics, I still need to go a long way to understand more deeply the significance of this presentation. And I am really happy and grateful to be able to read the papers of you and Professor Bong, and expect the others too. And we are happy to put together a very interesting edited volume. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we wish to leave time for discussion, although we are a bit beyond time, but this is our, I mean, we like to discuss and we exceed time limits sometimes. If Jonathan Bonk is not suffering very much because he has to leave. So, I mean, are there any questions?
I'm keeping diners out of my section of the restaurant.
Religious imperialism.
Thank you very much, Jean, for an extremely enlightening and thought-provoking paper. I do look forward to reading it very carefully. I wonder whether, given the fact that this forum is hosted by our Orthodox brothers and sisters, whether you've noticed whether any impact of these African forms of Christian expression on Orthodox churches, the Coptic Church, the Ethiopian Tawahedo Church, and let's say the Orthodox Church in Kenya. Is there any contagion? Are you seeing any crossover?
Yes, please, Professor Komarov, you may try to answer. It's very interesting for us when you discuss among yourselves.
Well, I don't know anything about what's going on with the Orthodox churches. It would be hard for me to say, but I do see that across the range, look, the Catholic Church has also been in an interestingly distinctive position in this whole story, because in many ways, they were much more sympathetic to many of the materialized forms of African religion. And they also, after all, started out and were from the beginning. I always say the Catholic Church is the oldest NGO in human history, right? I mean, there always was this embracing form of ministering to all aspects, from education to, to practical life and so on. But even there, I have seen that in the Catholic churches and the movements I know in South Africa, there has been an adoption of some of the forms. First of all, the use of electronic media, but also the readiness to discuss things. For instance, many of these churches have sessions on unemployment, sex education, businesses, I was saying. They bring in people from the business school, and the Archbishop of the most famous Anglican church of Bishop Tutu in Cape Town has recently come to America to take a business degree, because he feels so strongly that we have to overcome the sense that there's something blasphemous about putting these things together. And he cites that it's his experience of seeing these African churches develop to Africanize forms of Christianity, not only through Pentecostalism, but in other denominations, that has made him think that way. So in those forms of what I might call higher church organization, there has been an impact. And the point about these religious forms also means that membership is very different. People move between churches, and they go almost on a not quite fee-for-service basis. But there's that idea you come with particular problems to a church of which you might not be a member because you've heard there that they address these issues. So there's a sense in which this eroding of the line, which is the original African form. There's no form for religion in most African indigenous languages because it was part of life. There's forms for ritual and for ancestors and so on. But this fact that the religion flows over the whole terrain, and that these churches will have meetings every day of the week, not just on a Sunday. And they will address all of these issues, and they will get involved in political debates and so on. And that has had an impact, I think. I've seen that have an impact, very definitely, certainly on forms of more Orthodox mainstream European Christianity.
Professor Majoros, Professor Polychroniou, perhaps you have a comment?
Well, I'm not aware of the situation of the Orthodox Church in this field in Africa, but I suppose it's not so developed as in other Christian communities. I have no concrete data as far as concerned the question.
But is this development a good thing or a bad thing? We had two different views on this.
Yeah. Yes, if I may add to what especially Professor Bonk suggested, development is one thing, sustainable development is something different. So I think that there could be development that will obviously take into account the future and the planet and sustainability. So I think we have to try and use our knowledge, our experience, innovation in order to develop, but in a way that will not affect the future generations. And this is in fact what sustainable development is all about. To develop, but not affect the future generations. So we need to preserve the environment, we need to save the planet, and this is where disruptive innovation comes, to suggest new ways of doing so. So the best thing, I mean, the thin line, I think, that can combine everything is to try and achieve development, try to bring development and wealth, wealth in a way that the Africans will be able to sustain themselves in Africa. Develop their everyday life in a way, of course, that will not affect the environment, the planet, the society. So I think this is the fine line between going forward, but without bringing the negative impact of what has happened so far from the development of the last 100 years.
But
I would just comment, Jean, that in the case of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, I'm much more familiar with the Tawhid Church. There was one particular instance that stands out to me, and that is when about 1,000 young people in the little city of Dire Dawa went on strike because the Orthodox Church didn't have any Pentecostal elements. And so it obliged the church. The church adapted, and they began to employ contemporary music with instruments. They'd never had instruments in the church before, like guitars and so forth. They had only drums and timbral. But it's had quite an impact, and to some extent, it preserved. It permitted the young people to continue to go to church as Orthodox young people. The Professor Andrew Walls makes in his final manuscript, it's still to be published, but it's going to be published by Eerdmans this year sometime, is the comment that the world of the Enlightenment is a very tight, small, little universe. It doesn't have room for evil. It doesn't have room for spirits, for the terrifying powers that we have to cope with in our human crises. And that in Africa, that world is alive and well. And the Pentecostalism, there's a way to speak of it, to address it, to use it, to control it, and so on and so forth. So I just resonate with what you're saying. It certainly resonates with close observers of the African scene.
May I say one thing, just for the sake of it? I haven't been present at the conference, but when we talk about development, we assume, I don't know who the we is, and we assume a kind of, if you like, moral burden. I haven't heard the word China mentioned once in the session, but in fact, the entire momentum of development for good and ill, whatever we think of it, has been assumed on the continent. It's no longer a north-south vertical relationship between Europe and Africa. It's increasingly horizontal. It's between China, Africa. It's between India to some degree, even Turkey. Right? There are new kinds of south-south relationships which push development in some ways and sometimes are argued to be no less imperial than the story that is closing behind us of the European one. But certainly the idiom there is that we are people who have known colonialism. We are the South side. It's a more humane face of development. And the Chinese, of course, say it's not even development, it's business. It's business, and we have to, everything else is a kind of paternalistic view. And whatever we think of the project, we have to begin to understand it because it's become hugely influential. They have taken over where the West has stopped funding all kinds of things, including infrastructure building in African societies that need it greatly. And so there's a whole new ball game here that we have to be aware of if this is what we're going to be talking.
So when we Orthodox speak of self-sustainability of the local Orthodox churches, we have to bear in mind that global finances go a bit the other way around still, and we have to be wiser how to interplay with all this. I mean, even the explosion of the population, isn't it a result of development? I mean, we have as many births as we used to have, natural rate, but we do not have so many deaths at an early age. So we have a population explosion that naturally leads to migration. And solutions to these problems are very, very difficult. You cannot tell them from a Western point of view, you live eating roots from plants without having anything. This is not fair, because there are also questions of justice. And of course, the church has to provide some kind of wealth. I am with that, taking all the rest into account, that we do not need to cultivate a consumerist model, but we have to contain it ourselves first. So
exactly, I fully agree.
But maybe a war is coming and we get all very poor.
But so many of the issues that we see in Africa are global issues. You know, I mean, we wrote a book called How Europe is Evolving Towards Africa. And we didn't mean that that was necessarily a bad thing, but we were saying that Africa first has suffered, and now we are all suffering because of the way that I would argue global capitalism works. I mean, you in Greece above all know this experience of what it's been like to be part of Europe, you know. I mean, the colonialism hasn't come to an end. It's just having new dimensions, and they're now global. And Africa has, in a way, been ahead of the curve. If you look at the way they've coped with a pandemic, it's been really very interesting, because they've had pandemics before and they don't expect life to be safe. And they have both moral and material and practical ways of coping that come from a bitter experience in a way. But it's not that different from what we see in the West. Our youth are also unemployed. We're also dealing with the problem of the informal economies growing and so on. So, you know, it's I think one has to put it always in the global context.
Well, I don't see any question either here on Zoom, nor here in the room. And we have many YouTubers because we are also live streaming. So either it was all too new and too impressive, and we need some time to digest. Maybe I should come to a closure unless you wish to say something.
I'd like to thank all of you for your presentations, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this. I have to check out of my motel in 5 minutes, but I often think.
Could you open your microphone, please? You accidentally closed your microphone. Professor Bonk, you accidentally closed your microphone.
Professor Bonk, we can't hear you because you closed you are muted.
Closed. No, one click.
Yes.
Yes, no.
Okay.
Now it's okay.
In China, there are 3 times as many Christians estimated as there is population of Canada. So the church is not small. And when I've traveled there, for example, speaking to a group of professors at Renmin University, which is the People's University in Beijing, I talked to about 60 professors who call themselves the Nehemiah group, and they're Pentecostals. And they're very strongly serious Christians. And at a forum that we're having in Korea in November of 2023 on the environment and human calamity, one of the people who's coming as our presenter is the head of food supplies department at Renmin University, a very strong Christian professor. So I think Pentecostalism, such as you've described and noticed in Africa, has its own unique forms and attractions, because it does open up to a much larger universe than has ever been permitted by a strictly secular view of reality. So anyway, thank you very much.
And thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I say goodbye now.
Thank you very much for being here and for helping us put together a one-of-a-kind event. This is all new to Greek theology, to open so much to global issues. We are very much centered around ourselves, and it is always very interesting to learn so much. Africa has not been a focus of theological studies for quite a while, and it was the first time we did something like that. So I don't know what this conference has achieved. It brought very, very good and interesting people together, and we hope we have a continuity. We have many questions, and we are just starting. We have also started and initiated a discussion that would bring hopefully more understanding and reconciliation. And I would hope that we can continue at several levels. We haven't solved many things, but we start understanding the complexity of things and the variety of different angles and scopes. And I hope we are a bit closer together. I would like to thank my faculty, the rector, the dean, the presidents, the colleagues, Professor Christinaiki, who hosted it. I would like to thank Alison, who is in the academic committee, the bishops that were with us. We agreed, we disagreed. We spoke on an even level. That's very, very impressive sometimes. The many Africans that were with us during these 2 days. Alison, would you like to add something? No, it's okay. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you all.
And we will continue some way or another. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear all. The International Conference, Soundscapes of Africa, Theological, Anthropological and Legal Approaches is concluded. Ευχαριστούμε όλες και όλους. Το Διεθνές Συνέδριο Ηχοτοπία της Αφρικής, Θεολογικές, Ανθρωπολογικές και Δικαιικές Προσεγγίσεις έχει ολοκληρωθεί. Το συνέδριο αποτελεί πρωτοβουλία του Εργαστηρίου Κανονικού Δικαίου του Εθνικού και Καποδιστριακού Πανεπιστημίου Αθηνών και του Σωματείου Μνήμη και Πρωτοπορία. Ήταν μια πάρα πολύ σημαντική πρωτοβουλία. Ευχαριστούμε όλες και όλους που ανελιπώς το παρακολουθήσατε, είτε διαζώσεις από την αίθουσα οπτικοακουστικής διδασκαλίας της αναβαθμισμένης Θεολογικής Σχολής Αθηνών, είτε από το Zoom, από την εξαποστάσεως αυτή πολύτιμη δυνατότητα, είτε βέβαια και σε ζωντανή αναμετάδοση από το YouTube. Όσες και όσοι δεν έχουν γράψει τα στοιχεία τους, μπορούν τώρα να τα γράψουν, γιατί σε λίγο θα κλείσει το chat.